So thank you very much, everybody. Welcome again. I'm going to introduce our fabulous speakers today. You guys are in for a real treat. A lot to learn here and a lot to share. Hopefully we'll be learning from you too. So here we have Rajean, who is over to the far left. Rajean is a member of Spring, and same with Everett here, also a member of Spring. Both fabulous, fabulous folks. And before I hand it over to them, I just want to explain how the meeting will work. It's going to be similar to the other sessions if you've been to them. So the speakers will go first for a total of 30 minutes, and then we'll have questions and comments from the audience. All right, so the speakers will respond to your questions and comments at the very end as part of their closing remarks. If you'd like to speak, I'm going to end up asking you after the talk to raise your hand and add you to a speakers list. So I'll be using an equity speakers list, which just means that I may not call on you in the sequence you raised your hands, but we're going to be prioritizing Indigenous, Black, comrades of color, women, and first-time speakers. Questions or comments are welcome, but please try to keep your contributions to 3 minutes. This will allow for more contributions once we get to the discussion. All right, finally, we encourage you to post to social media throughout the conference to share your thoughts and experiences. So please use the hashtag RedOctober2025, and you can also tag Spring on all platforms using @SpringMag.ca. All right, I think we're all ready. So over to the speakers.
Cool. Hi, everyone. Nothing? Really? No hi? Okay, all right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this session. This session is part of Red October's Worker Power course, and the fight against South African Apartheid is one of the clearest case studies in how organized workers win. Too often, the history of Black working class leadership in the fight against apartheid is obscured or minimized in favor of an international solidarity story centered on boycotts and sanctions alone. We are doing our part in correcting that record. And we're doing it in the shadow of a horrific ongoing genocide in Palestine, where even after a declared ceasefire, hundreds of Palestinians have been killed. And our task today is to think deeply about what kinds of solidarity actually moves power. So 3 quick goals for our time together. We want to recenter Black working people as active agents in defeating apartheid, not as passive beneficiaries of external pressure, but as organizers who built institutions, risked their livelihoods, and won material power. 2, we want to draw practical lessons from that struggle for Palestinian solidarity today, not to pretend that the histories are identical, but to show which tactics shift the balance of power and which do not. And 3, we want to come away with concrete things that people in Canada can do to translate moral support into material leverage for Palestinian self-determination. Everett will open with a short overview of apartheid's political and economic architecture and the key institutional players. Then we'll walk through the Durban strikes and how working class self-organization created the structures that made nationwide pressure possible. Then I'll speak about the role of international worker solidarity. And finally, Everett will bridge those lessons into the present moment in Palestine. And then we'll open it up to a discussion. And so I think one more thing before we get into the session. We're not here today to lecture Palestinian organizers either here or in Palestine. We're here to learn from history so that we can better support their struggle on its terms. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Everett for some context on how apartheid functioned as racial capitalism.
Thanks, Rajean. To understand the apartheid system, it's important to understand that the colonial history of South Africa is a prime example of what Cedric Robinson called racial capitalism. Put simply, this concept is based on the recognition that capitalism and racism are not separate issues. The accumulation of capital demands the extraction of value from marginalized groups, which requires the unequal differentiation of human value and the creation of racial hierarchies. Ever since the 20th century, the South African government had been relocating and confining Black people to reservations where they were segregated from whites. When apartheid was implemented in 1948, the government designated homelands for different ethnic groups called Bantustans. This term was based on Pakistan and India, which is sometimes called Hindustan, which had just been partitioned in 1947, and it referred to the Bantu ethno-linguistic group which indigenous South Africans are a part of. The architects of apartheid promised a future where Bantustans would be legally independent entities, enjoying full rights alongside an independent white South Africa. In practice, black South Africans were evicted from their properties and forcibly displaced. The Bantustans, which comprised only 13% of the country, were universally underdeveloped and entirely dependent on the cities and centers of industry, which were owned by whites. The many black South Africans who stayed in cities were relegated to racially segregated townships through a system in which land was designated for the sole use of specific races. Apartheid must always be thought of as an economic system, and the townships played an important role in this functioning. Africans were stripped of their South African citizenship since they were considered to be citizens of their Bantustan homelands, yet they were still left with no other option than to sell their labor in the industrial centers. The townships emerged out of the necessity for cheap African labor. They couldn't actually deport everyone to the Bantustans when they needed them to work in the cities. So given this, during apartheid, black South Africans had very little political leeway, but they were still able to build a fighting labor movement. The 1973 Durban strikes, which Rajean will talk about, occurred in the context of 99 years of labor activism in and around Durban. Black dock workers usually led these struggles. They first struck in 1874 against colonial laws that hampered their bargaining power, and again in 1906 in solidarity with the Bambatha Rebellion, which was an anti-colonial uprising sparked by a head tax. Labor militancy would continue on and off through the 20s and 30s, and in the late 20s, most Durban dock workers joined the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, which had formed in Cape Town. Dock workers' fights were never just fights for economic issues. Their struggles were always also struggles against colonialism and the white supremacist government, and the sphere of political activity always expanded beyond their immediate economic concerns. This tendency was exemplified in leaders like Johannes Nkosi, who was a member of the South Africa Communist Party and a dock worker organizer. He was murdered in 1930, not for leading a strike, but for leading a burning of passbooks, which were the documents that permitted black South Africans to enter cities. In the 50s, the black labor movement became formally aligned with the ANC, the African National Congress, through the South African Conference of Trade Unions. The dock workers in Durban, due to their institutional knowledge, were a cornerstone of the labor movement during this decade of unrest. They possessed well-developed rank-and-file networks with experience operating underground and strong connections with both the Social Democratic African National Congress and the South African Communist Party. Furthermore, Durban was, until recently, the largest port in Africa. Its centrality to the South African economy gave dock workers enormous leverage and placed them at the center of coordinated labor action.
Hey, thank you, Everett. So that context sets the stage for one of the most decisive moments in the anti-apartheid struggle. When we talk about the fall of apartheid, the role of workers' resistance is often sidelined as if it was marginal to the story. Outside of the labor tradition in South Africa, it's rarely understood that workers weren't just supporting characters, they were central. It was the self-emancipation of the working class that created the conditions that built the structures strong enough to confront apartheid. The 1973 strikes in Durban are a turning point. They mark the beginning of a militant trade union movement that by the mid-1980s had apartheid reeling. To really appreciate what happened, it's important to look at the decade before. After the Sharpsville massacre in March 1960, the movement entered what looked like a long winter. On that day, about 20,000 people gathered peacefully outside a police station to protest the passed laws that restricted movement of black South Africans, and the state's response was sheer brutality. Police opened fire on the unarmed crowd, killing 69 people and wounding more than 180. A later report found that police had fired 700 bullets, almost entirely at people fleeing the scene. The images of bodies on the ground shocked the world, but inside South Africa, the consequences were devastating. The African National Congress, the ANC, or the Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC, were banned and their leaders were imprisoned or forced into exile. The South African Congress of Trade Unions, which had been aligned with the ANC, was driven underground, and strikes virtually disappeared. For more than a decade, white power felt unchallenged. The economy boomed, workers were disciplined at every turn, and the apartheid regime looked untouchable. Even when Durban dock workers struck in 1969, the apartheid state met them with guns, rounding up 2,000 men and shipping them back to the rural areas. By the end of the 1960s, apartheid seemed stable and impregnable. I try to say that word many times, I can't say it. But beneath the surface, things were shifting. A global economic downturn in the early 1970s hit South Africa hard. The US Federal Reserve had delinked the dollar from gold, oil production dropped, and OPEC countries raised prices in response, sending shockwaves through energy-dependent economies. Everyday life for African households, already precarious, became unbearable. Inflation soared, rail fares climbed, and wages stagnated. Then, in 1971, over 24,000, mostly women garment workers, walked out of factories around Durban, and many participated in a mass meeting at Curry's Fountain Sports Ground. Unable to quickly resort to disciplinary action due to the size of the job action, the employer quickly caved to the workers' demands, and the workers won a 20% wage increase. And it was a reminder that collective action could break the boss's grip. The following year, 1972, Durban dock workers struck again. Official narratives often describe this wave of militancy as spontaneous, but workers knew otherwise. Underground networks had been quietly preparing, letters and pamphlets circulated, and newspapers like the Isisebenzi, which means worker, gave voice to their anger. This renewed militancy set the stage for the explosion of 1973. On January 1973, at 3 a.m, African workers began leaving their compounds and hostels, steaming toward the football stadium in Durban. They moved through the city at dawn, chanting, "A person is dead, but their spirit lives. If you poke the iris of their eye, they still come alive." Out of textile mills, the brickworks, the municipal compounds, the tea processing plants, tens of thousands of workers flooded into the streets. What began as wage demands felt like a general strike, a mass refusal to be silent any longer. By the end of that month, between 65,000 and 100,000 workers had struck across more than 150 workplaces. Indian and African workers struck together despite the apartheid state's attempt to divide them, and traditional authorities and government officials tried to intervene, but workers refused to be represented or spoken for. Their power came from standing together and speaking in their own voice. These strikes weren't simply spontaneous outbursts. Like I mentioned earlier, underground networks, leaflets, worker newspapers had been preparing the ground. And while the immediate demands were for wages and dignity, food for their families, overalls to work in, relief from hunger, the strikes carried with them deeper political traditions. At night, in secret, workers would bring out buried ANC pamphlets. They sang Nkosesekele Africa, which means God bless Africa, on the picket lines that later actually became a part of South Africa's national anthem. Sam Mlongo later described the strikes as having a detonating effect. Even though they were settled, the impact rippled outward, radicalizing workers and showing that even economic struggles could open the way to revolution. This was the Durban moment, and it birthed a democratic culture from below: mass meetings, consensus decision-making, women stepping into leadership, workers refusing tutelage, and Frantz Fanon described it as a mutual current of enlightenment and enrichment between working-class militancy and intellectual currents. But the heart of it was simple. Workers realized that by standing together, they had power, and that power could shake the foundations of apartheid.
Thanks, Rajean. The way these strikes unfolded became emblematic of the unity of the labor movement and the movement for national liberation. One moment in particular stood out for its brazen rejection of the apartheid status quo. But first, some context. Durban is located in what is now KwaZulu-Natal province, which during apartheid was divided between the semi-independent Bantustan of KwaZulu and the province of Natal. This area is the traditional homeland of the Zulu, who historically were ruled by the Zulu royal family. Colonization and South African rule had severely eroded the role of the Zulu monarchy, and they usually had no more authority than what the colonists would grant them for the purposes of indirect rule. Still, they remained important symbolic figures, and the traditional Zulu political establishment did well for itself under the colonial system. Enter Mangosuthu Buthelezi, not part of the Zulu royal family, but the chief of a clan who, he claimed, had traditionally served as the Zulu king's chief advisors. The king appointed him traditional prime minister of the Zulu nation, a brand new position. A council of mostly traditional leaders elected him as the chief executive officer of the Zululand Territorial Authority in 1970, and he remained in power through its transformation into the KwaZulu Bantustan. Buthelezi publicly opposed apartheid, lobbied for the release of Nelson Mandela, and opposed the sham independence that KwaZulu was provided. He also promoted free markets, discouraged armed struggle, and firmly opposed international sanctions. He was fully on board with national liberation, as long as it didn't interfere with his business or challenge traditional authorities. In any case, Buthelezi here is only important insofar as is illustrative of the strata of black South African elites who profited off the Bantustan system. Almost all were well-established traditional leaders who did fight against apartheid in their way, but they actively worked against the mass mobilization and working class activity that would consistently bring the biggest shocks to the apartheid status quo. When the Durban dock workers struck in 1972, the white bosses in the South African state colluded to undermine the resistance, however possible. But they were not the only forces fighting against the workers' uprising. J.B. Buthelezi, Chief Mangosuthu's uncle, appeared on the docks as the personal representative of his nephew. He oversaw the weeding out of organizers who were fired and deported from Durban, and then tried to insinuate himself between the striking workers and the Natal Employers Association as a spokesperson of the black workers. The key moment occurred during a speech he gave, or tried to give, to the dock workers. As he began his address, one worker shouted, "Who is this man? Who elected him to represent us?" He tried to keep talking, but more and more voices joined in shouting him down until he was forced to leave. One worker recalled that it was at this meeting where we realized our power because we were talking for ourselves. This confrontation between the emissary of the traditional Zulu leadership and the dock workers exemplified the clash between the resuscitated national traditions of the bourgeoisie and the creation of a new national culture that was revolutionary and truly of the people. In the words of Frantz Fanon, the desire to attach oneself to tradition or bring abandoned traditions to life again does not only mean going against the current of history, but also opposing one's own people. J.B. Buthelezi being shouted down stands out as a key moment in the practical political education of the black working class in South Africa. It crystallized the class character of the national liberation movement, which would not be stayed by the bourgeois collaborators who tried to intercede on their behalf.
So what followed in the wake of these strikes was the slow and deliberate work of building something lasting, the architecture of a movement strong enough to carry the fight into the 1980s. The militancy that erupted in Durban didn't fade, it evolved. Out of those shop floor networks came new organizations, new leaders, a new kind of political culture that linked democracy in the workplace to democracy in society. By the late 1970s, the tremors of Durban had spread across the country. In 1979, black trade unions were finally legalized, and out of that opening came the formation of the Federation of South Africa Trade Unions, or FASATU. FASATU carried forward the spirit of the Durban strikes. It was built on workers' control, on the empowerment of shop stewards, and on the belief that democratic practices forged in the workplace could become the foundation of a democratic society. Its slogan said plainly, "Building tomorrow today." This vision crystallized in 1982 in a speech by FASATU's Secretary General Joe Foster. Foster insisted that workers had to build their own organization, independent and powerful, even while joining in the wider struggle against apartheid. He warned that if workers simply handed their movement over to others, even allies in the liberation struggle, those same allies might one day turn against them. Foster's speech became a touchstone for what we now call the workerist position. The idea that sustaining the autonomy of working class organization was essential, not optional. And this was essentially the socialist pull inside the movement. Not everyone agreed. Within the unions and the broader movement, there was a running debate, workerists versus populists. Workerists argued for independence from the ANC and the multi-class national liberation movement, so workers could sustain their own power. Populists, by contrast, saw white supremacy as the overriding enemy and pushed for maximum unity, even if it meant subordinating labor's autonomy to the national cause. By 1985, the balance tipped. FASATU dissolved into a new, much larger confederation, COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Unions. Launched in Durban at the Curry's Fountain, COSATU explicitly allied itself with the United Democratic Front and the ANC. COSATU became an extraordinarily powerful force and helped push apartheid to the brink. But the critique raised by the workers still matters, because what happened when apartheid formally ended? Racial segregation fell, but capitalism remained intact. As Dr. Trevor Ngwe puts it, political apartheid ended, but economic apartheid continued. The ruling class made a calculation: better to concede the end of white-only rule than to risk losing capitalist control. The compromise gave South Africa the vote, but it left untouched the structures of economic inequality, and that's why, decades later, the struggle continues, because democracy without economic transformation is incomplete.
Thanks, Rajean. The workers' uprisings that characterized the early 70s gathered steam for a series of confrontations with the apartheid government that would not end until 1994 when apartheid ended. But not all of working class militancy was led by workers themselves. During the Soweto uprising in 1976, it was the students that found themselves on the cusp of the movement for national liberation. Soweto, whose name comes from the shortening of Southwest Townships, is a black township in the city of Johannesburg. Recall that apartheid laws enabled whites to strip non-whites of their rights as citizens, and that townships were allowed to exist to provide an underclass of cheap labor close to cities. White capitalist labor needs also dictated the education system in the townships. In the early 1970s, the government identified a need for skilled African workers and began putting more money into schools. As a result of the investment, between 1974 and 1976, the number of students increased by 140%. In Soweto, this meant building over 40 new schools, while secondary school enrollments jumped 300%. School is incredibly popular for working class children who have few opportunities for advancement otherwise. The influx of educational spending came to a sudden halt due to the oil crisis. There were suddenly thousands of students in Soweto who were experiencing the effects of an abrupt drop-off in the quality of their education. This alone was causing unrest among students, but then a new government policy would push things over the edge. For context, at the time, English and Afrikaans were the two national languages in South Africa. Although African languages were the most commonly spoken first languages, they had no official status. They were used in elementary schools all the same, and English was used as the main language of instruction in secondary schools. Because of the linguistic diversity in South Africa, English had become recognized as a lingua franca. Plus, because of its widespread usage abroad, it was considered an asset by those who learned it in school. It's important to remember that the apartheid government wasn't just a white supremacist government, but an Afrikaner supremacist government. Afrikaners descend from Dutch colonists who were the first Europeans to settle in South Africa in the 1600s. The British arrived over 200 years later and pushed Afrikaners out from the Cape Colony, partly because the Afrikaners were ardent slaveholders and the British were outlawing slavery in their colonies at the time. Their conflict resulted in the First and Second Boer Wars, which the British won thanks to scorched earth tactics and concentration camps in which over 27,000 Afrikaners died. Although white solidarity with the English would always trump their differences when dealing with Africans, right-wing Afrikaner identity was anti-English and rested on the myth of being an oppressed minority striving for self-determination. When the ultra-right National Party won the whites-only election in 1948, it was on a platform of Afrikaner nationalism, and the main pillar of that platform was apartheid. So when the Bantu Education Department announced that Afrikaans would be required as a language of instruction split 50-50 with English, it was not well received by black South Africans. English and Afrikaans were both colonial languages, but while one was perceived as useful and relatively depoliticized, the other was a language spoken nowhere but South Africa and was being mobilized as part of a campaign of racial oppression. The law was literally the brainchild of a secret society of Afrikaner nationalists who wanted to teach Afrikaans to black students so that they would be better workers for Afrikaner bosses. Of the two languages, it was Afrikaans that Desmond Tutu called the language of the oppressor. The rollout of the new law was a disaster. An African student might spend their first years of school being taught math in isiZulu, then continue in English while still using isiZulu to grasp difficult concepts. Then suddenly, in high school, be forced to learn math in Afrikaans, possibly from a teacher who had never learned to teach in Afrikaans. This was especially difficult in townships like Soweto, where few people spoke the language. It stunted children's education as they were forced to grapple with language acquisition instead of the concepts being taught. It was in Soweto that students took matters into their own hands. In April 1976, students began refusing to go to school to protest the law. The strikes were ad hoc at first, but were soon formed into a coherent force by the strong protest culture of the time. They found their most ardent supporters in organizations affiliated with the Black Consciousness Movement, a grassroots movement of students, intellectuals, and trade unionists that spread ideas about black pride and national liberation and rejected the condescending values of white liberals. 19-year-old Teboho Mashinini was a high school student at the rigorous Morris Isaacson High School, head of the debate team, and very popular. He had been involved with strikes across the township and decided to plan a mass demonstration for June 16th. He organized an action committee of students called the Soweto Students Representative Council, supported by the Black Consciousness Movement, and began spreading the word. The action committee had won support from teachers and the public by emphasizing discipline and nonviolent action, and were able to bring massive numbers of students into the streets. When the day came, between 3,000 and 20,000 students walked out from their schools and made their way towards Orlando Stadium for a mass rally, singing and carrying placards that said, "Down with Afrikaans." In response to this march of young people, the police barricaded the route and started to disperse the crowd. They escalated to tear gas and live ammunition, then set the dogs on the students. When one of these dogs was killed, the police began shooting indiscriminately at the children. 15-year-old Hastings Ndlovu and 12-year-old Hector Peterson were among the first to be killed. The police violence turned the peaceful march into a brutal scene of mayhem and slaughter. In the end, between 176 and 600 people were killed and over 1,000 wounded, almost all of them children. The Soweto uprising, although tragic, was a watershed moment in the fight against apartheid. It occurred right as the first Bantustan was declaring its independence from South Africa, and while the government was attempting a positive, modern rebrand of apartheid. The images of the uprising made it around the world and shattered those illusions. The UN passed a resolution condemning South Africa, and the economy faltered due to the ensuing instability and the strength of international sanctions. Across the country, students staged solidarity walkouts, workers launched strikes, and recruitment for independence groups surged. It radicalized a new generation of students who would go on to take on prominent roles in anti-apartheid organizing, and it cemented the unity of the students' movement and the workers' movement. After the uprising, apartheid South Africa was never able to regain its standing.
The struggle inside South Africa was reshaping the balance of power, but it didn't stay contained within the country's borders. What was happening on the docks, in the mines, and in the factories began to resonate with workers around the world. Because when workers move, they don't just change their own conditions, they send signals down global supply chains. And that's where the story of international solidarity becomes so powerful. When organized labor in other countries refuse complicity and join the fight against apartheid from their own workplaces. When we talk about international solidarity, it's easy to reduce it to consumer boycotts or moral appeals, but the South African struggle shows us something sharper. Solidarity is strongest when it flows from organized worker power. The example I want to share comes from Oakland in 1984. A Dutch ship, the Ned Lloyd Kimberley, docked in San Francisco carrying South African cargo. Auto parts, steel, wine. Longshore workers from International Longshore and Warehouse Union, ILWU Local 10, refused to unload it. For 10 days, they stood firm, essentially striking against apartheid. That action didn't appear out of thin air. Since 1976, after the Soweto uprising, rank-and-file dockers in Local 10 had formed the South African Liberation Support Committee. They organized events, built connections with South African workers, and educated their co-workers. They pushed their union to divest pension funds and won divestment victories in Berkeley and Oakland. In October 1984, they even screened the anti-apartheid film Last Grave at Dimbaze at a union meeting, and immediately after the screening voted to boycott the next ship carrying South African goods. When the ship arrived, the action was carefully organized. Sympathetic dispatchers filled job calls with workers who were committed to the boycott, so no one would be forced into a position they weren't ready to take. And that meant those who refused the work weren't paid, a real sacrifice. Employers sought a federal injunction threatening fines and jail time, but workers stuck with it. This was not charity or solidarity from afar. It was labor refusing complicity, and it mattered. Within months, their action rippled outward, helping to spark campus divestment protests, including at UC Berkeley, which pressured their board of regents to divest their multi-billion-dollar endowment. Not all solidarity action carries the same weight. Consumer boycotts and cultural boycotts have their place. They can build awareness and shift public perception, but they don't often strike the centers of capital power, and they can be co-opted or reduced to symbolism. Worker-based solidarity is different. When labor withholds cooperation, it is a structural intervention in global capital chains. That same spirit is alive today. Dock workers in Italy have refused to handle Israeli arms shipments, disrupting the flow of weapons and exercising the same leverage that Local 10 wielded in the 1980s. So what lessons can we draw from that? Well, first, solidarity must be worker to worker, not consumer to consumer. Workers acting collectively have leverage that moral appeals alone never will. 2, it requires sacrifice and risk. ILWU workers went without pay and faced illegal threats. Solidarity isn't always safe or cost-free. 3, symbolic actions matter, but disruption is decisive. Boycotts and protests build momentum, but refusing cooperation at the point of production and circulation is what hurts capital. 4, strategic solidarity follows the supply chain. Whether in Durban in 1972, Oakland in 1984, or Genoa in 2024, the port is a pressure point. Workers who understand their power can disrupt the machinery of war and apartheid. And finally, the refusal to move cargo didn't come from abstract calls or outside pressure. It was a result from systemic education and organizing that built workers' confidence to act on their power. There are no shortcuts to that kind of solidarity.
All right, we are going to try to rush through linking this to Palestine. So the use of the term apartheid when describing Palestine is in many ways apt, as it does resemble apartheid South Africa. Both were welfare states for one ethnicity based off of the expropriation of another, and both created subclasses of non-citizens without full rights in order to exploit their labor. Plus, they actively collaborated on their shared interest in racial oppression. Israel's early plans for Gaza and the West Bank were directly modeled off of Bantustans, and the two countries were the best of friends during the apartheid era. Still, there are key differences that prevent the South African freedom struggle from providing a step-by-step guide to Palestinian liberation. For instance, South Africa depended on black labor to a far greater extent than Israel depends on Palestinian labor. It developed from its origins as a plantation economy into a society that still needed black labor to function, so its apartheid system had no interest in exterminating the native population. Israel, on the other hand, is much less economically dependent on the labor of Palestinians, nor do Palestinians make up the overwhelming majority of the population in Israel-Palestine as black people did in South Africa. The result is that Palestinians do not have the same economic leverage as the organized black working class in South Africa. But the apparent balance of power in Palestine changes drastically if we consider the Palestinian cause in the context of the working classes across the Arab world. Israeli domination of Palestine is only made possible by the anti-democratic leadership across Arab countries. Polling by the Arab Opinion Index in 2018 showed that 77% of respondents supported the statement that the various Arab peoples constituted a single nation, and 3/4 agreed that the Palestinian cause concerns all Arabs and not the Palestinians alone. Movements for democratic rights in Egypt, Syria, or Iraq, for example, would challenge Israel's hold on Palestine because an enfranchised Arab population would be unlikely to accept the current deal. The important point is that it will be Palestinians buoyed by a rising Arab working class who ultimately win the fight for liberation. In South Africa, boycott, divestment, and sanctions put pressure on the government and gave it far less wiggle room when it confronted the upheavals of its workers at home. As we are shown by the examples of the dock workers in Oakland and the students of UC Berkeley, our contribution to Palestinian liberation increases to the degree that we can translate our support into the material deprivation of Israel.